Hello and welcome. Today we are talking about biometrics, privacy, and the embodied internet. My name is Coode. I am a privacy and cybersecurity consultant and founder of Binary Tattoo. And I am super excited to get started on this session on biometrics. When I think of biometrics, I am going back to like Minority Report, where people were cutting out each other's eyeballs to get into buildings. And that is a little bit of what biometrics is. But biometrics is also the collection of all the information about who you are. So it's not just retina scans and fingerprints and voice prints, but it could also be behavioral analytics and all sorts of information. So whether the biometrics in your company are being deployed within a product or service that you are offering, or if it's part of your security system, as a CISO, you are squarely responsible for the information that you collect, use, transfer, and retain. So to talk about this today, I have a stellar panel. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask you each to tell me one example of a biometrics that you think consumers are going to think is really great or beneficial or cool, and one example of biometrics that you think is frivolous or dangerous or crazy. Larry, why don't you kick us off?
Hey, so I'm Larry Cameron. I'm a Chief Information Security Officer at the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative. I'm also a blockchain forensics lead and OSINT investigator, which is open source intelligence for the National Child Protection Task Force. I think a great, cool, and beneficial form of biometrics is a behavioral. One that I noted, there was an algorithm for the signature. It was actually the height, and then it was based on another calculation by the width over time. So I find that that's really effective. It's not a basic one that, you just compare a signature, but, I find that one's pretty good. One that I feel is ridiculous or dangerous would be the DNA one, obviously, because you don't want to pass out your DNA and you don't want to feel like you're a diabetic every day.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Abigail, how about you?
Right. So first about myself, I'm a lawyer and privacy professional now based in Canada, and specializing in privacy writing and advising on it. And I spent 4 years in the UK on the GDPR, so Quebec, Ontario, Canada, so on. I'm going to give you from a consumer or regulator perspective rather than my own opinion. From a consumer perspective, I think anything that makes their lives easier. So voice-enabled technology is really exciting. If you can log into your bank account using your voice as opposed to having to put in all kinds of PIN codes and things like that, I think they like that. I think the things that probably, especially a regulator, possibly also a consumer, would find over the top and unnecessary would be targeted advertising and profiling using biometrics. So targeting me with ads because now my voice sounds a little bit different and you're discerning that maybe I'm a bit low, or I've made a facial expression, or my heart rate's a bit faster than usual, and now you're in my face trying to pitch me products instead of just leaving me alone. That's me speaking as a consumer if I were that hypothetical consumer.
Awesome, thank you. And Harsha, you go ahead.
Thank you, Kat. Hello, everyone. I'm Harsha Vachher. I'm a software engineer and architect by trade. With 15 plus years of hands-on experience in cybersecurity, IoT, and operational technology, I started my company, KTech Labs, focusing real estate cybersecurity. I support building owners and facility teams to defend their buildings from cyber threats. Biometric has scaled up in many ways. So one of the cool examples that I have seen in the buildings is to simply wave hand for biometric identification. So that's a touchless fingerprint scanner. And one of the craziest implementation of biometric is I've seen in a sports facility, in a wellness center. So biometric readers that identify users based on the geometry of veins in their hands, which can typically be a reliable identifier. But the problem is that after a sports person had worked out, there's enough change due to sweat and dirt from exercise to cause the readers to misidentify people.
Awesome, excellent examples. One of my favorite examples is for fraud detection, which a lot of people don't realize you can do. And so a lot of banks and things are saying, hey, if you keep logging into this account really quickly and you're creating a new account and you seem to know where all the buttons are, that looks a little suspect. So from a fraud detection perspective, I think that's great. I also appreciate anything that uses veins can also give away medical data. So my scary one is anything where you're using retinal scans or anything like that, where it may actually give away more medical information than you intend to about illness or disease. So in terms of biometrics, if anyone is unaware, there are actually multiple regulations coming down. And I know we have a global audience today. So, but I will say in the United States right now, there are 9 states that have biometric regulations about how you are to use this. There are actually 17 additional states with proposed biometric bills and regulations. But the big one here in Canada that we're looking at is Bill 64, which is in Quebec. And that is coming down. And so if you either have any consumers in Quebec or customers, or if you are a Canadian company in Quebec, it is really important to understand that. So I'm going to turn this one over to Abigail because I know she's done quite a bit of research from the legal perspective. What does this mean? What does it mean to have this biometrics regulation in Canada?
Okay, well, first of all, in Quebec, it's already enforced. That's not new. So there is a law other than the private sector privacy law that does regulate the use of biometrics. It's gotten tougher and stricter under Law 64. So in a nutshell, in addition to requiring express consent, there are a lot of requirements up front in terms of the design and what you do. A lot of the sorts of things we'd probably be talking about later today on security and minimizing how much you collect. But just on the first point, right now, as of now, you are required to notify the regulator, which is the Commission d'Accès à l'Information, or CAI for short, in advance of launching a biometric system. What's a biometric system? This is a database that you create to use a system, for example, to identify or authenticate people. It could possibly be broader than that. But there's also a requirement to get express consent and give people notice. Now with Law 64, that's gotten even tougher. Why? Because there are new requirements that come in that will impact how you use biometrics. One is that the requirements for consent are much, much more stringent now under the law. 2, you are required to have a minimum 60-day prior notification period to the CAI. So the CAI needs to be notified 60 days in advance of you creating a biometric system or database. 3, there's a mandatory privacy impact assessment requirement for any technological product or service that you create, and that would include biometrics. And the PIA requirement is a prior requirement that is proportional to the sensitivity and the amount of data and so on and so forth. And because it's proportionate and this is high risk data, you need to go all out on this one. This is not the one to do your slapdash last minute PIA. So anticipate your PIA needs to be done. You need to follow the guide that has a lot of strict requirements in terms of minimal number of characteristics that you capture. If you discover medical information in the course of using biometrics that are used to authenticate a person, you do not keep that, and you don't even proactively disclose it. So I wouldn't tell Kat, looks like you're diabetic or pre-diabetic unless she asks me. And there are a number of other requirements as well in terms of, keeping the data federated, not keeping the raw biometrics and so on and so forth that are in a guide, which I'll put the link to in the chat. However, there's one new addition as well that I'd like to add, well, 2 new additions. One I'll talk about when we talk about third parties, but the other one that I want to talk about is that they've made another modification, which is before there were 2 requirements under biometrics. One was if you're creating a database, and the other one was just if you're using biometrics to identify or authenticate a person. So you're not creating a database yourself. Now, even in the case where you're using biometrics, you have to give prior notification to the CAI. So in addition to express consent, prior notification. Why? Because it's too much of a burden on individuals to anticipate that they're going to know enough and be informed enough about all the possible uses that could come out of it, that there's this added watchdog feature that's been implemented, even if you're not keeping the biometrics or the biometric derived data derived from the biometrics in that case.
Wow. Okay. So a lot.
So there's even more. But I'll put a link to the guide in the.
A lot of steps, but it is a heads up. So, Larry, I'm going to go to you on the next one. Like, obviously, biometrics. What's the deal? Like, we have PCI DSS for financial. We've got health information. What makes biometrics special, and why do we have these heightened risks around biometrics?
So biometrics basically link a person to this particular data record. I mean, it's just how license plates and driver's license and insurance being linked to a vehicle and their owner. So every type of authentication, they do have weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Many can be bypassed with simple methods or require more advanced tactics. Sometimes using a combination of multiple different types of biometrics can combat these issues. But just imagine if you have a database and that's compromised, that it's not like the movies where you get to chop off the finger. Today's methods are actually duplicating that fingerprint and using it. So imagine if you could do more targeted attacks, already have it. So you can get into a house, you can get into a vehicle, you can do a whole bunch of bypass scenarios where biometrics may be used in the future.
That's great. Yeah. Harsha, what about you from a building perspective? What if someone wants biometrics for their building? What's the heightened risk there?
The main selling point for biometrics is to provide more security in the identification process. It's a way to ensure that the users are who they are and that they have the permission to access the building or a specific area. Now, access control system or biometrics are meant to provide a function, but either the device is not built to have password protection or the person who installed it just get it up and running. In either case, not much effort is put to install the security with it. Now, coming to the building, our first natural thought is access control systems or biometrics are attacked because attackers want to gain access to an area. For instance, in a worst case scenario, in a highly controlled environment like a hospital or a data center, a compromised access control system could be used to lock surgeons or people in a room. That's one reason. But the other reason is attacker simply wants to access the network. And biometrics is as good an entry point as any other system. Now, any attack or a data breach to this system in a building could be used to exploit operating information, cause tenant discomfort, or interrupt facility operations, contribute to equipment damage and brand damage.
Kat, can I add to the conversation here? Because I think those are such important points and underscore the importance of securing the data. But I think there are other risks that regulators and lawmakers are particularly attuned to, and advocates, that go beyond just securing the data. So even using biometric data for its intended purpose can have a number of privacy risks. So leaving aside the false positives and the false negatives, the big concern, and we saw this with Clearview AI, is the notion of the right to anonymity disappearing, right? So with Clearview AI, it's like everyone is sort of presumed guilty until found to be innocent, right? If everyone's biometrics are being captured, you can be identified at any time, at any place. And the person who has the power to make that identification or to exercise any sort of power subsequent to that can then make your life very miserable or very happy. Now, there might be some law enforcement circumstances where that's justified, but if you're in a regime which is much more authoritarian, that doesn't like people who look like you, and they decide that you are, based on your biometric features, they've concluded that you are of this particular ethnic minority, as we've seen in China with the Uyghurs, then you are effectively living in a digital panopticon. And so the biometric data, although the point we made in the beginning about it being something that links you to a piece of information, it is so much more. And that's why I love the title, which is the embodied, what did you call it? The embodied internet. Yeah, embodied internet, because it effectively, it treats the body as a source of truth, but that truth can be used in various ways. If the truth is if it's not accurate, if it's not captured properly, and there are false identifications or misidentifications, that can be problematic. But it goes, in Canadian privacy law, we talk about your biographical core, and the closer something is to your biographical core, like health data and things like that, sexual orientation, religion, the more sensitive it is. It doesn't get more sensitive than what is literally embodied in you and immutable. That's what makes it attractive from a security perspective, is that in theory, it's me, right? If I can say with certainty it's me, and it's immutable, and that's never going to change even 30 years from now. And that can have very good applications. But the other flip side is, once it's breached, as we saw in Afghanistan with the takeover by the Taliban, it is something you can never get back. I can't replace it like my social insurance number. So those are some of the concerns that, especially in the face of inequality, that a lot of regulators and advocates have around biometrics, if not used properly.
Excellent. Yeah, and I love that point. And you can't get your face print back, short of having some kind of surgery. But you also hinted to the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate. Like when you're applying this, there's a risk that if you don't have a biometric that identifies with certainty. There was that problem when iPhone was originally released and there were facial recognition scans, and some children were able to open their parents' phones because their faces were similar enough. So it has to be basically bulletproof, which is definitely one of the risks. So if we have all these risks, which we certainly do, why bother? What are the benefits of using a biometric if the risk is so high? What do you think, Harsha?
That's a great question, Kat. So though there are risks using biometrics in a building, but what we have seen is more building owners and facility managers are turning to biometrics to streamline movement throughout their building. Biometric door locks, high definition security camera systems are easy to relocate across the workplace and are optimized for connectivity. They offer flexible security and gives the option that they need to reconfigure, prioritize, and stay lean. Now, there are various range of options. Biometric access devices, they use fingerprints, iris scans, facial recognition, and other technologies like palm vein authentication. It all depends what kind of facility is and what kind of security we need in that building. But what they do is they allow building owners and managers to choose the right level of security for each area in a building. Now, they can also put in a room access, a computer access. And one of the other benefits that we see is enhanced tenant experience. And one of the reasons to use biometric readers in a building is they allow the flexibility with daily operations, because tenants or the building occupants, they can gain access to the building via hand readers. They do not need to carry physical pass cards. Also, we don't see many technical difficulties while using these biometric readers. And when there is a reliable backup available.
Excellent points. Larry, what about you? What do you think? What are the benefits of the biometrics?
Oh, it's the ease of use as well. I mean, how many times have you forgot your password, or have you lost your card in order to your common access card? I mean, it's quite frequent that stuff like that happens. And, passwords are really the weakest link to the system access. So using something that is you is a lot more efficient, effective. It's less likely to be attacked and exploited. It's not immune to these types of attacks, but it's generally a lot less likely. It'd have to be targeted. They'd need to know where the person works, for instance, and what they access using those specific biometrics, and they'd have to get past front door security. So, it's not like you can do it remotely. I mean, there was one incident where I was responding to a hack, but when I audited everything, it looked like they turned on the biometric, the thumbprint authentication, but when they reset their password, they didn't remove that thumbprint. So the person still had access to their accounts by using their thumbprint, even after they changed their password. So you also need to, take that into account. As long as you have strong security policies, then it should be more secure.
And when you use biometrics, you were saying, it's the something you are, the MFA. Like when you're using multi-factor authentication, is that a second factor, or are you replacing the authentication with biometrics?
So you can do dual biometrics. So if you do a thumbprint and then a retinal scan, for instance, I mean, people are less likely to have both if they're going to try to compromise it. It's going to be really difficult.
So that's part of it. Abigail, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest one to justify, and the one that has the, because when we think about it in terms of necessity and proportionality, right? And do we really need this? And authentication is probably the best, with a close second in certain situations being identification. I'll explain why. With authentication, for a lot of the reasons that you already mentioned, it's a lot harder to game a biometric, although you can have false acceptance rates and false rejection rates. But provided you've handled all of that, it's you don't have to collect and centrally hold, and in fact you're not supposed to, at least in Quebec and under best practices, actual raw biometrics or even the biometric templates, right? And so there are a lot of things you can do to make sure control remains with the individual when it's for authentication purposes, right? It really is just a yes or no. Is it a match? Is it not a match? And then you have to make sure you fine tune your algorithms and that you've got your false acceptance rate under control. Where identification becomes a lot more tricky because you're basically comparing one to many, right? Not one to one. So you're comparing one image of cat against a whole image of crowds to try and identify, is this the same person? And that's where you get this whole notion of everyone being swept up in the dragnet of surveillance, right? And if it's not managed properly and it's used for, targeted advertising instead of for, legitimate investigation by law enforcement with probable cause or reasonable grounds to believe or some kind of threshold that has to be met, then it becomes a slippery slope. And, you've got Facebook neighborhood watch groups maybe, or, your next door group using their own, version of facial recognition.
That's perfect. And that's actually a great segue because I was just going to ask that. But before I do, I just wanted to remind anyone watching that we do have the chat. And if there's any questions that you have about biometrics and privacy and the embodied internet, drop them in the chat and then they'll come through to us and then we can hopefully answer them for you. Okay, so I did want to take a couple minutes to talk about image capture and photos, and you touched on it, Abigail. And we know historically at this point that facial recognition for people of color with certain face shapes, it sucks. It doesn't work. It's discriminatory. But it's also can be very useful, Larry. And I know you have an interesting angle on this from the OSINT perspective and from the legal perspective from the police. So what do you think from the biometrics perspective of image capture? Are we doing more harm than good? Is it okay to capture it if you have the right reasons to do so?
Yeah, the problem with open source intelligence is that anybody can get access to it. So if somebody wants to create a profile, they just need to really Google you and you're going to find all these pictures. You're going to be able to create that. I mean, some, facial recognition were bypassed by using a picture. So, that kind of holds to, what you need to protect and, how accessible it should be. I mean, if thumbprints were compromised, what's preventing Google from creating something that can go out to all the phones and compare against their thumbprint to kind of map people to phones? So the risk is somewhat greater, especially when you consider, your phones use thumbprints, different applications. So you could actually tie those applications to people and you can tie devices to people. I mean, I think there's a greater risk. The retinal, another thing, I mean, that's not used that much, but, it's used at airports. So if you start using that for your phone, what's to say they're not going to do it at airports so they can kind of tie everything together? If you're using a phone and authenticating it using biometrics, but it's kind of like a burner phone or a law enforcement phone, you can kind of detect those sort of things.
That's great points. And obviously the combined data set becomes a huge risk. Harsha, lots of people I know use either facial recognition for entry into buildings or they're using cameras to monitor. So if our CISOs are looking to use any kind of that systems in their buildings, what do we need to know about that?
In terms of building, yes, we have seen cameras installed taking regular feeds. But when it comes to applying AI, capturing images, we don't see much of the use cases in the commercial space. In the retail building, I remember there was one example where on the digital screen that was made to navigate through the building to understand what are the amenities in the retail building. There was one incident when a camera was installed to capture the image of the person who is browsing the screen. So that caused a lot of privacy and security considerations. And so yes, when it comes to capturing image, we need tenants, and there are unfortunately not much laws when it comes to tenant and the landlord relationship in this regard.
And I think that speaks also to the power imbalance that you need to be sensitive to when you decide to deploy these sorts of tools. Any tool that you have is, can be used for good and it can be used for not so good, and it depends on who uses it, right? So the question that you need to think about are what are the compensating controls that we have in place? So with anything, whether it's your privacy impact assessment, your threat risk assessment, you're always looking at this in the back of your mind. You always need to be thinking about, is it really necessary? Is there a better alternative? And is our approach proportionate? And then in terms of the risks we've identified, how have we reduced them to an acceptable level of risk, and what compensating controls have we put in place? And with that, we can talk about security. And as the CISO, obviously you're going to be looking at what is within your area of expertise, but it's really important to work with multidisciplinary teams, because the procurement team doesn't know what you know, and you don't necessarily know what they know. Legal doesn't have necessarily, unless they've made it a point, because I'm interested in this stuff, so I'm a geek, but not all lawyers really understand this stuff. And so they're just reviewing the contracts or drafting them. So there are a lot of things you need to think about. So when we talk about security, often you talk about access control. Well, built into the third-party relationships, which we'll talk about, I think, pretty soon, a lot of these suppliers who you're outsourcing this to, because most of the time it's outsourced and not in-house, they carve out all kinds of privileges for themselves and rights for themselves under their standard terms. And if you're not reading closely, and if your whoever's procuring the service isn't reading closely, you might be agreeing to something of a breach, which you might not realize is a breach, but if you knew it in plain terms and what it actually means in terms of the data supply chain and how it's going to be used, it would be a breach. So I think that's another issue that we need to sort of think about in that respect.
For sure. And one thing that we have seen is productivity software. And it's become, we had productivity monitoring software prior to the pandemic, but once workforces were sent home, and I have to say, maybe I'm just privileged to always have worked with people who work hard, I find it very invasive. I wouldn't want a piece of software on my computer tracking my time. But I do appreciate in some roles, in some cultures, in some businesses, that is the way they operate, and that they do need to make sure people are working. But these softwares are tracking bio breaks. They are potentially tracking all sorts of information, which again, to me, gives away your medical information. I mean, if you have to go to the washroom 3 times an hour, there might be a problem. You've now given that information back. So in terms of this kind of programming, which is again another biometric, now we're going internal instead of the external security. We're looking at internal data that's being collected on employees. What do we need to do? Do we need consent for this? Can employees opt out of this? Abigail, from the legal perspective, what do you think?
Can we take a step back before we even talk about the consent and everything else, and talk about the design? A lot of things have to be done on the design side, and we hinted at some of them, but you can't disentangle the role of algorithms in something like this. So you're talking about for performance, right? An algorithm is a values-based decision. This is this is that, right? So this is what productive looks like. I'm going to assume that being in front of your computer and tapping away is productivity, whereas sitting and reflecting, which sometimes, especially writers, often need to do, is not considered productive time. There are a lot of things that you need to sort of question at the design stage. But to get to your actual question, which is around the consent, and that's going to depend on the different regime you're in. So under the GDPR, using consent in the employment context is pretty much not a possibility, because you need to have free, informed, et cetera, consent. And for biometrics, they use to identify someone, it needs to be explicit consent. So there are exceptions within the GDPR for grounds on which you can do that, and I won't go into that into a lot of detail here. But I think the point is, like in a context like Quebec, where it says you do have to give consent, you also have to give an alternative, which means you need to still work on a robust alternative if you don't think your alternatives are good enough. You need to make sure people are really informed and that they understand. And so, for example, the CHI has a sample privacy notice that you could use, and I've included a link to the CHI's biometric guide to make sure people are really informed. But you also need to really think about when you are getting the consent, tracking that they've gotten it, and what you're going to do in cases where they withdraw their consent, because they have a right to withdraw it. So what does that mean for you? Well, one, it means you need to have systems and processes in place to destroy whatever the, well, you shouldn't be keeping the biometric template, but whatever you have in place related to that biometric needs to be destroyed. You need to make sure that you are fully addressing that. And again, in our complex data supply chains, that becomes really, really tricky if we're not careful at the design stage about how we distribute that data. But yeah, in an employment context, it's employee comfort is going to be really important. And the backlash against teams and their productivity thing, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of employers that employees don't feel comfortable. And in a talent market where talent is hard to come by, you need to treat your employees right. Well, you should always treat your employees right, but it could become a talent management issue.
Respect for sure. Yeah. Larry, as a CISO, is this something you would use or not a fan?
So as for biometrics in general, I mean, I'm a fan. I mean, there's different security considerations you need to take. If they're storing that data locally, then that's a lot better. And then there's a difference between storing it on a device and storing it centrally in a shared database. So I think when you start going up in your risk, you need to kind of take a step back and look at it better. If at any time biometrics were stored in the cloud, that's a big no for me, because I know it can happen in the cloud. You know, when we do investigations, sometimes we pivot on actual passwords. So if someone's using a password that we're investigating that we know of, we can pivot on that password and find other email addresses that are using the same password, and then kind of do an extra layer of validation. I mean, this, again, you can do it for biometric data, especially when you're collecting it in mass.
And I know, Harsha, as Larry had kind of alluded to, we also have IoT mixed in here with, so from that perspective, there's issues right there. So is there an IoT biometric? Is this twice as bad? Where are we going with that?
I'll share a story with you on this. So every time we talk to landlords and tenants on mobile key access, having not your physical passcard, but a mobile key access or biometrics. So landlords are more than interested because it helps them streamline the operations. But when it comes to tenants, we see a lot of pushback. Okay, now you're going to track where I'm going in the building. I don't know what data you'll capture. I'll have to install your app on my mobile. I don't know what that app going to capture from my mobile. So there's a lot of concern when it comes to tenant. Though we do implement such solutions in a building, and we have seen a rise in mobile key access in the past few years. But when it comes to capturing the data, we are very much mindful as what data. So it needs to be anonymous. Okay, Harsha was on the 3rd floor. Harsha was on the ground floor. No. Anonymously capture that this passcard was tabbed how many times in a building and where. Because now when we are talking about smart buildings and integrated solution, we not only use it for mobile key access, but also use this data to understand the occupancy in the building. So that's where we're very mindful in how we capture the data and also how we store this data.
That's a really important point too, Kat, that I think we absolutely have to talk about, which is repurposing, because there are certain situations where it might be justified. And in this case, if you're streaming the data into different streams and occupancy, those are aggregated numbers that you're not linking back to individuals. There's the authentication piece, which is, are you supposed to come in or are you not supposed to come in? And that's kept separate. That's fine. But your point about downloading the app and then I'm on your website and now I've made a complaint to there's the risk of a God view coming up and someone having something very, very detailed and a very detailed picture of you. And in a landlord-tenant relationship, those relationships can be nice, but often are fraught. And add to that the complexities of now we've had big corporations buying up lots and lots of properties so that they can become these mega landlords, right? And so they're landlords to loads and loads of people. Then they're using cloud, they're using all kinds of vendors. Before you know it, everyone has your data everywhere, and that includes biometric data, and some of it which is very revealing of things like your health, your ethnicity, possibly, possibly sexual orientation, some have said. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that can be revealed. And, for the convenience, for the security, is that a justifiable trade-off? Do we have to have a trade-off? I like, what we were saying earlier about like, keep it local. Once it's in the cloud, don't assume it stays in the cloud. And then yeah, the big risk for me is it's the fine print with the vendor contracts, because they do want to teach their algorithms. They want to train them and enrich them, and that's understandable. And they want to use your tenants' data to do it. And they assert an ownership right over it. And it's not just about ownership, because it's still related to me and inevitably attached to me always. So this notion that sort of that's your property now and you can do whatever you want with it is a really, really risky proposition with any personal data, but especially when it comes to something as intimate and unchangeable and immutable as your biometric data.
And you know what, I think right now, let's get into vendors. But before we do, I just wanted to, one of my own little pet peeves is people get conflated between de-identified and anonymized. So anonymized data, which is truly anonymized, you can't identify an individual based on that data, whereas de-identified data typically has some kind of identification with it. So as Harsha had said, like if you're using a key card to get into all sorts of places, maybe the key card is listed by a number and not all your personal information. That's a better system. Anonymized would be the best. But what people need to consider, what your companies need to consider, is that combining two data sets together has an inherent increased risk, even if both of them are anonymized, because I've heard this multiple times where they're like, well, there's no way of identifying because this one was anonymized and this one was anonymized. But I won't say often, but sometimes depending on the data set you have, you can identify someone, and then the risk increases 10, 100-fold. So when we're going to talk about vendors, we're talking about that kind of thing is also, you know, you've got two anonymized vendors, but if you combine those data sets under your roof, you might be revealing more about these people and inferred data than you intend to. And then of course, that's putting you at risk as a CISO because you're now trying to manage that information. So vendor management, everyone loves vendor management. It's its own topic. Larry, why don't you get us started? If you're bringing on a biometric vendor, is there any kind of special consideration you would be looking at outside of regular vendor management assessment and considerations?
So again, it's the storage of the data. Where is that stored? Is it, you know, locally on an individual device basis? Is it centrally on a server? Is it in the cloud? What are their security policies? What's their compliance? Do they have proper security operations center implemented? Regular pen testing? If I'm about to buy, you know, hundreds of devices or thousands of devices for employees, I'm going to want those tested myself. I'm not going to rely on a vendor to do that. Also need to make sure that they wouldn't sell the data or misuse it. You know, you have to get a clear picture of what they're doing with it.
Excellent. Now, Harsha, I know you bring in both software and hardware into the buildings that you help. What would your vendor management, it's probably a lot, what would you suggest?
Yes, Kat, like in a building, we deal with multiple vendors, right? From the traditional building systems, building automation, lighting, elevators, and now coming to IoT devices. These days, we talk about IoT devices, solutions, analytics. And what happens with these type of solutions is in a rush to bring the product or a solution to market, they lack the security by design approach. So vendor risk assessment plays a key role here. So vendor risk assessment should be based on the actual risk to the building. It could be different in a commercial building and could be different in a retail building. So this should be based on where the solution you are installing to ensure that the vendors are committed to the process. The other thing is there are multiple stakeholders involved in a building when it comes to solution. Not only the property management team, tenants, CISO, and marketing. There are multiple stakeholders. So it is important to understand the goals and then to support for the vendor security risk management efforts. The most important thing here to understand is if the vendors get hacked, it cascades to the building. Now, I'll give you the example of a digital screen that we put in a building. We have digital signage. Like I walk into an office building, there's a digital signage that can tell, okay, this client is on this floor, washroom is on your left, transit is here. In most of the cases we have seen, these digital signage are being managed by third party. Property management, they give the information, okay, here is the announcement that you need to put on the digital signage, and that's it. Everything is managed by the vendor. Now imagine if the vendor gets hacked, it cascades to the property. There could be objectionable thing that is displayed on the digital signage, and the property will be in news everywhere. So vendor risk assessment plays a key role, and it needs to be done not once when we put the solution, but needs to be done regularly to understand they are still following the cybersecurity best practices.
Excellent. And what about you, Abigail?
Well, Harsha, you touched on a few things right there that I think are really important is that you need to identify your own risk appetite first in order to assess the risk of associated with a vendor. On that, though, for me, the frame of reference is risk to individuals and their privacy interests when you're doing a PIA and a TRA, especially under privacy regulations. So you need to understand, their practices, as you mentioned, but the other point you mentioned, if they get breached, what have you got in place in terms of breach notification and breach response? One throwaway provision in your contract is not enough. What actually happens on a process, from a process perspective? Are you agreed on what you consider to be a breach that's reportable to them? Within what time period? So there's a whole thing you could do just on the breach response, and there needs to be clear guidance on who gets informed. Where's your security operations center? Who's the point of contact? But leaving that aside, on the earlier point about what are they doing with it, that's the one that preoccupies me the most, and as a privacy professional. So the two things that preoccupy me the most are the algorithmic integrity. So what's actually being used to make the decisions, and how have they tested that? But also on repurposing. And so because these are so intertwined, there is a real value and a real interest for a vendor to want to train their algorithm. And as someone who's advised both vendors and people doing those vendor assessments, I can appreciate that. But as to Kat's point, anonymization is not a fixed state, right? Data is not a fixed thing. It moves, it breathes, it doesn't quite breathe, but it moves and it changes, right? And so when we talk about protecting against the risk of data that's repurposed for the purposes of doing this sort of analysis, and we're calling it anonymized, well, now under Quebec, it has to be irreversibly anonymized. And that means that you need to have put in controls beyond just transforming the data, but beyond that in terms of what it gets mixed with, where it's shared, all of those other factors, who has access to it, what they can do with it, and an explicit prohibition against any effort to re-identify that's binding on them, their employees, their agents, and so on. So that's important on that side. So unless it is actually anonymized, and to that point, I would want to see that they've actually got some kind of third party, or they've used something that is defensible in terms of their re-identification risk assessment that they've conducted and the controls that they've put in place. So I'd want to see their white paper on that if they're saying it is anonymized. The risks are far too high, especially with Quebec. On the other side of things, the reality is that they all reserve to themselves the right to repurpose biometrics. And I think that's extremely problematic. From a Quebec perspective now, everyone knows about the mandatory PIA, but there are three actually mandatory PIAs that come into play here. One is the PIA you need to do if you're transferring data outside of Quebec, personal data outside of Quebec, which is likely going to happen since vendors have stuff all over the place. And so you're going to have to do a transfer risk assessment that's in there. And you'll also have to do one if they are using it for research purposes, including commercial research. There's a specialized PIA that that Law 64 requires for research purposes, and that includes a research protocol and a number of other things. And that means the vendor themselves will have had to do a lot of work and presented to you their own PIA as well. And so that actually comes into force in the first year. So there's a 3-year transition period for Quebec. Most of the stuff comes in after 2 years. So in 2023, that one is 2021. So people are not talking about that enough. I think it's something we need to think about when we think about vendors. And I mean, repurposing for other purposes, they have other business lines. If you're doing your PIA based on authentication, and then now they're saying, hey, we have this other product we want to upsell on performance management, I'm not keen. I'll just be right honest and say my own opinion. I'm really not keen. I think there are too many problems with trying to use biometrics for performance or for profiling for a lot of reasons. And I'm not sure that the risks outweigh the benefits, but I could be convinced. But if you're an employer and you're starting out by saying this is for authentication purposes, and now you're slipping into this secondary use, well, in Quebec, again, and most Canadian laws, that's a no-no. You need to go right back and get your fresh consent, do your assessment, and so on, and put in your controls. But often that's not what happens with vendors. They upsell you some sales team or somebody else likes the idea, HR wants to use it in recruitment, and that leads to a host of problems. I put a bunch of links in here to things that elaborate on all of those, by the way, if anyone wants to look at the chat.
That's great. Thank you. A lot of great points. One thing that that we didn't say, I mean, we talked about storage and storage and storage, so it's clearly important. But is your vendor, do you have servers on-prem for you? Do they have them on-prem? Are they making a copy? Because sometimes they have a copy of your data. Why do they have a copy? Is that a backup? Is that a continuity issue? Or is that something, again, Abigail had said it, are they reusing this data to train their own algorithms? And if so, how do we know that this data is truly anonymized and they're not putting your customers' data or your employees' data, depending on what the software does? How do we know that they're not putting them at risk?
And mingling as well. Sorry, to Harsha's point about the app, device ID. I mean, then now you've got something that you can use and that can be sold to other, or it's not sold, it is shared. It's shared all across the ad tech network, right? And so that if you keep those physically separated and logically separated, that really helps. So the biometric is not matched to the device ID and so on.
Yeah, and I guess one question I have for all of you, I mean, I'm sure all of us have dealt with these data protection assessments from above, from below, from a vendor to a vendor, depending if you're B2B, where you're filling this stuff out. Yes, we have an incident response plan. Yes, we have this. Is there a minimum security certificate that you would look at and say, yes, if they're ISO certified, if they're SOC 2 certified, we're good? Is there one that you would say covers biometrics or the security level required for biometrics? Or are we like, no, everything has to be looked at for each individual company? We're just having head shakes. So you don't think there is a security standard that would cover this?
No.
There isn't something specifically covering biometrics to date, which is a real shame. There are a lot of there's a lot of guidance, there's a lot of regulatory work that's been done. There are a lot of, and again, it's intermingled with work that's being done on AI and automated decision making. And so the Global Privacy Assembly actually, there are all kinds of things that have come out around that and around facial recognition and so on. But yeah, as a standard with requirements that, the technical requirements and so on that you can actually assess against, no. That said, I do think that there are some hygiene factors you can look for. So SOC 2 certainly does give a lot of assurance, at least on the security side of things, but I would layer on to that and add to your compliance matrix. I think actually a really good start is the KAI's biometric guide, because it goes through quite a lot. It's not everything, and it's specifically dealing with identification and authentication. It's not focused on other uses of biometrics. So I think you do need to look at those in particular. Algorithmic auditing, absolutely. Have they done an algorithmic audit? They need to be able to defend their algorithms, right? And that they're good. So another thing too that you could look at is for your own use when you're at the outset of a project, it's okay. It's not the best in the world, but it's a good start. There's an algorithmic impact assessment that the government of Canada has put out, and it's available for free. You can do it online, and it doesn't capture any of your data. They say so. It's just sort of spits out an answer. It'll give you some indication of some of the things you need to think about more broadly when you're using algorithms. And although it's not specific to biometrics, you piece that together with some of the KAI guidance and some of the GPA, the Global Privacy Assembly and so on guidance, and you can get something really helpful there. On de-anonymization, de-identification and anonymization, I would really want to see that they've had a third party or that they've used some kind of defensible position and they have a white paper on it. And I'd want to see schematics. I want to see system architecture, at least at a high level, data flow diagrams and those things at a minimum to be able to ask pinpointed questions.
And I think this comes back to that point you made, Abigail, about procurement doesn't always know the technical details when they're right. So you really do need an army of people in here to look over these vendors before you're bringing them in.
Well, I think even beforehand, before you go to RFP, especially if you're in the public sector, there needs to at least be a preliminary PIA and TRA. So you develop your requirements, because you don't know your requirements until you've identified risks that need to be mitigated, right? And then I think the CISO absolutely, and the Privacy Pro and legal to a certain extent have to be at the table at the outset when you're creating your specs and your requirements, because and then that also going forward, that can be something that can be in your project documentation that procurement has on hand, right?
Yeah, oh, so we're almost at the end. I just did want to say Abigail's been adding these wonderful links to our internal speaker chat, but I know someone at CyberX is going to pull them and put them into the chat for the actual session. So you should be able to get those. So one person had asked, and I appreciate this, about when you phone in somewhere and it says, this call is being recorded for training purposes. Could somebody take your voice off that call and then reuse it and then save a biometric voice print off of that call? So what do you think? Is that, I mean, you shouldn't, but.
Sadly, someone could do that with our talk today. I'm sure there are voice prints of me hanging out somewhere. I did something with Patricia Thane actually on voice biometrics, and we were all like, we're lost because we do too many speaking engagements. So what people can do? Yes. Legally, can they? No, legally they cannot. In most jurisdictions, they need to tell you in advance, and they need to get your consent, or they need to have some compelling lawful basis to do it. Practically speaking, they can. We saw that with the TikTok update to their privacy notice. They were pushed to do that because they were facing heat from regulators and litigants, where they had to update their privacy notice to say, we may also use your videos to harvest basically your voice and your face for to create biometric templates. So yes, it can happen.
Excellent. So I'm going to come back, and we're still getting a few questions in, but I want to get everyone a chance to give some advice that they have to CISOs about the use of biometrics, reconsidering perhaps the biometrics they're already using. Larry, why don't you go ahead first?
I had something to say back on the de-anonymization aspect. So, I mean, we use cryptocurrency. People think it's anonymous. We're able to de-anonymize people based on that. And also, we do a lot of dark web investigations. Dark web is not anonymous. It's very easy to find identities. We also we're able to do this with anonymous location data as well. I'm able to find out where you live, where you work, where you travel, and put that to an identity. And just on top of that, do you want to repeat your question?
Yeah, absolutely. What pieces of advice would you give to fellow CISOs on what they should be considering, either bringing in new biometric vendors or perhaps the biometrics they're already using in-house?
Yeah, just make sure that there's good algorithms in the biometric. Like, you can't just kind of fake it. I mean, even there's some with thumbprint where they detect thermal, or if there's a temperature there. Always do your own research and pen testing. Don't rely up to third parties, because, I've, done assessments before when third parties have, and I find a lot of stuff that they don't report on. Make sure the additional features are not easily bypassed. Ease of deployment is key. Again, storage is key. Have policies in place just in case something does happen. Verify their adherence to the compliance policies, even if you have to go in and audit them to make sure they do what they say they do, which is more ISO. Make sure there's zero information sharing. If they're going to sell your biometric data or, share it, then that's the biggest no-no. And after it's deleted, or after let's say your subscription ends, make sure that they do delete that data. Validate that even from backups.
That's great. Yeah. And we didn't talk a lot about retention, but certainly retention of biometrics is a thing. Abigail, did you want to go ahead?
Well, to add to that point, from a B2B perspective, I would ask for a certificate of destruction, and I would want a minimum level of sanitization standard to be met. So I would want detail on how they're actually destroying it. But the fact is, ideally, they should not be centrally managing it, especially if it's for authentication. That should be local. That should be edge. That should be the piece of the puzzle that has to be added for authentication. Back to your question, though, you were saying, can you repeat the question, Kat?
Yes. What would be your sum up of tips or advice for the CISOs on what to consider, either about the technology that they're already using or in the future of bringing biometrics into their company?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all goes back to necessity, fairness, and proportionality as a starting point. Do you really need this? you need to have a compelling reason why. Is it proportionate? And then within that, you absolutely need to tread lightly. This is not information we can easily replace. And the consequences, especially as we've seen in terms of social injustice and social inequality, are immense. It's far too dangerous to take lightly. So do your homework, do your reading, and make sure you get in early. Force your way in, elbow your way into the table early on to make sure that they're getting these things on the table. They're going to be forced to anyway, because a lot of regulators are saying relying on consent alone is just, it's not fair. It's not fair to ask a layperson to know what we know already. And I've spent so much time on this, right? On the not being anonymous thing, I just put in a fun story from the BBC into the links about Dread Pirate Roberts, the Silk Road, the anonymous Silk Road. He ended up getting found in a Google search because somebody pieced together the many different puzzles, his Starbucks loyalty card and his a Google search and something that he wrote anonymously, which was linked back to his email address. So yeah, it's really hard to be anonymous these days.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Harsha, what do you think? What are the advice that you give on bringing technology in or assessing the technology you already have?
From the building point of view, it's important to understand the risk landscape that is created by the interconnection of IT and OT. Understand and plan how to integrate third-party tech providers and outsource systems into the building. In addition to maintaining up-to-date and accurate inventory of devices, software that you have in the building. And when it comes to building, we don't see having latest patches. So that's one of the things I would say. Ensure all the software and hardware is updated with latest patches and not hosting any vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers. And then ensure there are multiple levels of protection in place, right from securing the network to monitoring the real-time anomalies.
Excellent. All right, I to sum up, I mean, we've covered this biometrics. It's sensitive data, but it is more sensitive data. It is irreplaceable data. More so potentially even than financial data and health data is the biometric data. So it's not to be taken lightly. If you are bringing in systems and services into your company that handle biometrics, there is obviously a litany of things to consider, including regulations, vendor management, protection, the entire data lifecycle. Where is this data being stored? How's it being transferred? How's it being accessed? Where is it being retained? How's it being retained? How are you destroying it? And if you're putting biometrics into your own products, also having these considerations on whether or not it is a necessity and can you justify the risk. I cannot thank my guests enough. Thank you. All three of you have been amazing. Thank you for your time and your insight. If you do have questions, you can probably track us down in Cyber Exchange and come find us. And hopefully we have given you some food for thought today on biometrics. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.